War is often remembered through victories, heroes, and decisive battles. But behind every front line of the First World War, there were plans, carefully drawn strategies that did not just fail, but spiraled completely out of control. This video explores 20 real strategies of the First World War that were meant to change the course of history, and instead created chaos, massive loss of life, and consequences no general had truly anticipated. From miscalculated offensives to technological gambles that backfired, this is the story of how strategy itself became one of the war's greatest enemies. It's great to have you here. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. In August 1914, Europe marched to war, convinced it would be over by Christmas. The belief was not naive optimism. It was built on military doctrine, rigid planning, and an almost blind faith in pre-war strategy. Nowhere was this clearer than in Germany's Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed years before the first shot was fired. On paper, it was brilliant. A massive right-wing sweep through Belgium, a rapid defeat of France in 6 weeks, and then a full pivot east to face Russia. In reality, it became the first example of a strategy unraveling under the weight of reality. Belgian resistance was far stronger than expected. British forces arrived faster than planned, and German supply lines stretched to the breaking point. By the time German troops reached the Marne River, exhausted and underfed, the plan collapsed. What was supposed to be a lightning victory froze into trench warfare that would last 4 years. France entered the war with its own disastrous gamble, Plan 17. French doctrine emphasized offensive spirit above all else, the belief that sheer determination and aggressive attack could overcome modern firepower. French soldiers marched into battle wearing bright blue coats and red trousers, advancing in dense formations against German machine guns and artillery. The result was catastrophic. In the opening weeks alone, France suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. The strategy had not accounted for how industrialized warfare had transformed the battlefield. Courage did not stop bullets, and offensive zeal could not overcome entrenched firepower. The French army paid for this miscalculation in blood. As the Western Front stagnated, both sides searched desperately for a breakthrough. This desperation led to one of the most infamous strategic failures of the war, the Battle of the Somme. Planned as a joint Anglo-French offensive in 1916, the Somme was intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and finally break the German lines. The strategy relied heavily on an unprecedented artillery bombardment. For 7 days, over 1.5 million shells were fired, under the assumption that no German soldier could survive such destruction. But many shells failed to explode, and German troops sheltered deep in reinforced bunkers. When British soldiers went over the top on July 1, 1916, they walked into intact machine gun nests. By nightfall, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, the worst day in its military history. The strategy had not just failed, it had created a slaughter. At Verdun, strategy became obsession. The German High Command did not intend to capture the city. Instead, they aimed to bleed France white. Verdun was chosen precisely because it was symbolically important. The belief was that France would defend it at any cost, allowing Germany to inflict catastrophic casualties. What followed was a 10-month-long nightmare. Both sides poured men into a battle of attrition that consumed entire divisions for minimal territorial gain. The strategy succeeded only in one sense. It bled armies on both sides, drained resources, and shattered the illusion that calculated suffering could be controlled. Verdun became less a military operation and more a grinding machine of death that neither side could stop. Technology, once seen as the solution to trench warfare, often made matters worse. The first large-scale use of poison gas at Ypres in 1915 was intended to break the stalemate. Chlorine gas drifted toward Allied lines, creating panic and opening a temporary gap. But the Germans were unprepared to exploit the breakthrough, and the wind soon shifted unpredictably. Gas warfare quickly escalated, with both sides deploying increasingly lethal chemicals. Instead of delivering decisive victories, gas introduced a new layer of horror, indiscriminately killing, maiming, and terrorizing soldiers, while failing to produce strategic results. What was meant to be a war-winning innovation became a symbol of uncontrolled escalation. Naval strategy was no safer from miscalculation. Britain relied heavily on a distant blockade to strangle Germany economically. While effective in the long term, it pushed Germany towards unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats were ordered to sink any ship approaching British waters, including civilian vessels. The sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, including Americans, turned global opinion sharply against Germany. What was intended as economic warfare instead helped draw the United States closer to entering the conflict. Strategy at sea had ignited political consequences far beyond the naval battlefield. On the Eastern Front, vast distances and poor infrastructure turned strategy into chaos. Russian offensives were often launched with incomplete intelligence, inadequate supplies, and poorly trained troops. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 initially succeeded by abandoning rigid tactics in favor of surprise and infiltration, but success created its own disaster. Russian forces advanced too far, too fast, without reserves or logistical support. The offensive collapsed, exhausting Russia's army and accelerating internal unrest. What began as one of the most effective operations of the war ended by contributing to the collapse of the Russian state itself. Perhaps no example better illustrates strategy spiraling out of control than Gallipoli. Conceived as a bold plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia, the campaign was plagued by poor intelligence, underestimation of the enemy, and confused command. Allied troops landed on heavily defended beaches, trapped by cliffs and Turkish positions. Months of fighting achieved almost nothing. Disease, heat, and constant fire wore down the soldiers. Eventually, the Allies evacuated, one of the few operations that went smoothly, but only after tens of thousands of casualties. Gallipoli became a case study in how ambition without preparation leads to disaster.
Across all fronts, one pattern repeated itself. Generals planned wars on maps, while soldiers fought them in mud, blood, and terror. Strategies assumed obedience, endurance, and predictability. Reality offered none of these. Orders were delayed, terrain was misunderstood, and human limits were ignored. Each failed plan forced commanders to double down, convinced that one more push would bring victory. Instead, it brought more graves. By the end of the First World War, entire strategies had collapsed along with empires. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire all fell, not just because they lost battles, but because their grand plans had devoured their own foundations. The war exposed a brutal truth. In industrialized conflict, even the most carefully designed strategies can become uncontrollable forces of destruction. And this was only the beginning. As the First World War dragged on, it became clear that strategy was no longer just failing. It was colliding head-on with the limits of human endurance and flawed command structures. One of the most dangerous assumptions shared by nearly every army was that discipline and obedience could compensate for bad planning. Orders were expected to be followed without question, even when they made no tactical sense on the ground. This belief turned countless operations into disasters that unfolded exactly as planned, on paper. Communication breakdowns were among the most underestimated strategic failures of the war. Field commanders relied on runners, signal flags, and primitive telephone lines that were constantly destroyed by artillery fire. Orders issued hours earlier often arrived when the situation had completely changed. Entire battalions advanced into areas already lost, or attacked positions that no longer existed. At the Battle of Loos in 1915, British commanders launched an offensive relying on gas warfare and artillery coordination. Gas was released, but wind conditions shifted unpredictably. Instead of drifting toward German lines, the gas rolled back into British trenches. Officers at headquarters, unaware of the chaos, ordered the attack to proceed. Thousands of soldiers advanced, coughing, blinded, and disoriented, into enemy fire. The strategy was not revised, it was obeyed. Rigid hierarchy proved lethal. Generals miles behind the front often refused to adapt plans once set in motion, seeing flexibility as weakness. During repeated offensives along the Western Front, attacks were scheduled by the clock rather than battlefield conditions. If an assault was planned for 7:30 a.m., it went forward at 7:30 a.m. Even if artillery support had failed, even if reconnaissance showed defenses intact, even if survivors from previous waves warned of impossible odds. Strategy had become ritual. Nowhere was this more evident than in the repeated use of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. Despite overwhelming evidence that machine guns and barbed wire made such attacks suicidal, armies continued to employ them. At Passchendaele in 1917, British forces attacked across a landscape transformed into liquid mud by relentless shelling and rain. Men drowned in shell holes. Tanks sank before reaching enemy lines. Yet the offensive continued for months, driven by the belief that persistence itself would eventually bring success. The strategy ignored terrain, weather, and human limits. The result was one of the most infamous symbols of feudal sacrifice in military history. Intelligence failures further distorted strategy. Reconnaissance aircraft provided valuable information, but interpretation lagged behind technology. Reports warning of intact enemy defenses were often dismissed because they contradicted expectations. At times, intelligence was shaped to fit strategy rather than the other way around. Commanders convinced themselves that the enemy was weakening, even as casualties mounted. This self-deception allowed failed operations to be repeated with minor variations, producing identical results. The introduction of new weapons created strategic illusions. Tanks, first used by the British in 1916, were seen as a miracle solution. Early successes led to exaggerated expectations, but tanks were mechanically unreliable, slow, and vulnerable. When deployed without infantry coordination or logistical support, they became isolated targets. At Cambrai, tanks initially achieved a breakthrough, but the lack of reserves allowed German forces to counterattack and regain lost ground. The lesson was clear, yet repeatedly ignored. Technology could not compensate for strategic blindness. On the Eastern Front, Austro-Hungarian command failures revealed the dangers of multinational armies bound by poor coordination. Language barriers, ethnic tensions, and inconsistent training made unified strategy nearly impossible. Orders were misunderstood or ignored. Entire units collapsed under pressure, not due to cowardice, but because they were never truly integrated into a cohesive fighting force. Strategic plans assumed unity where none existed. Leadership personalities also shaped failure. Some commanders viewed retreat as dishonor, even when withdrawal was the only rational option. Others clung to outdated doctrines to protect their reputations. Admitting failure meant professional ruin. As a result, strategies were defended long after they had proven disastrous. Soldiers paid the price for pride. The human cost of these failures extended beyond the battlefield. Prolonged exposure to relentless bombardment and hopeless attacks shattered morale. Soldiers developed what was then called shell shock, a condition poorly understood and often punished rather than treated. Strategy demanded endurance. Psychology was ignored.
Armies discovered too late that fear, exhaustion, and trauma could break even the most disciplined forces. By 1917, mutinies erupted. French soldiers refused to attack after repeated senseless offensives. Russian troops abandoned positions altogether, fueling revolution. Strategy had crossed a breaking point. When men no longer believed their sacrifice served a purpose, obedience collapsed. The First World War revealed a terrifying paradox. The more meticulously strategies were planned, the more catastrophic their failure could be when reality intervened. Maps did not bleed, timetables did not panic, orders did not drown in mud. Men did. And yet, commanders continued to search for the perfect plan, one final strategy that would restore control.
By the later years of the First World War, strategy was no longer about clever maneuver or decisive victory. It had become an act of desperation. Nations were exhausted, economies strained, and entire generations consumed by the conflict. Yet instead of restraint, the response was escalation. Commanders pushed harder, demanded more, and gambled everything on strategies that promised salvation but often delivered collapse. Total war transformed strategy into something relentless and unforgiving. Civilian populations were no longer distant from the battlefield. They became part of the strategic equation. Bombardment extended beyond trenches to cities, factories, and ports. Strategic bombing emerged not as a refined doctrine, but as an experiment born of frustration. Early air raids aimed to disrupt industry and morale, but they lacked accuracy and clear objectives. Rather than shortening the war, they hardened civilian resolve and expanded the scope of suffering. Strategy had escaped the battlefield and entered daily life. One of the most dramatic examples of desperation-driven strategy was Germany's return to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. German leadership knew the risks. They understood that sinking neutral ships could provoke the United States into war. But faced with starvation under the British blockade, they gambled everything on speed. The calculation was simple. Britain would collapse before America could mobilize. It was a cold mathematical strategy, and it failed. The United States entered the war, bringing fresh troops, vast resources, and renewed momentum to the Allied cause. Germany had traded a strategic problem for an existential one. On land, armies pursued breakthrough at any cost. The concept of attrition had dominated for years, but by 1918 it was clear that attrition alone would destroy everyone involved. Germany launched the Spring Offensive, a massive series of attacks designed to win the war before American forces could arrive in full strength. New infiltration tactics, stormtrooper units, and flexible movement initially achieved stunning success. Allied lines bent and broke in places. But once again, strategy outpaced the logistics. Advancing troops outran their supplies, communication faltered, and objectives became unclear. Exhausted soldiers paused to loot captured Allied depots instead of pressing forward. The offensive stalled. Germany had spent its last reserves. Meanwhile, the Allies learned painful lessons, slowly. Unified command was established under General Ferdinand Foch, reducing the chaos of competing strategies. For the first time, coordination replaced rivalry. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry were used together rather than in isolation. This was not brilliance born overnight, but adaptation forced by years of failure. Strategy became less rigid, more responsive, but the cost of learning had been enormous. The collapse of empires illustrated the ultimate failure of grand strategy. Austria-Hungary disintegrated under the strain of ethnic division and military defeat. The Ottoman Empire fractured as Arab revolts, supported by Allied forces, dismantled its control from within. Russia exited the war entirely after revolution consumed the state. Each collapse was accelerated by strategic decisions that ignored political and social realities. War plans assumed loyalty, stability, and obedience. Reality delivered hunger, dissent, and rebellion. Perhaps the most haunting strategic failure was the belief that suffering itself could be weaponized indefinitely. Leaders believed nations could endure limitless loss if victory was promised at the end. But societies have breaking points. By the final year of the war, populations were starving, soldiers were traumatized, and faith in leadership had eroded. Strategy had achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of preserving nations, it hollowed them out. When the armistice finally came in November 1918, it did not feel like victory to many. It felt like exhaustion. The war ended not with a decisive battlefield triumph, but with the collapse of the will and capacity to continue. Strategies had not delivered control. They had consumed everything placed in their path. The First World War left behind more than destroyed landscapes and lost lives. It left a legacy of lessons written in blood. Military academies studied the failures relentlessly. New doctrines emerged, shaped by what went wrong rather than what went right. Yet even as the world vowed never to repeat such mistakes, the seeds of future conflicts were already planted. When historians look back on the First World War, they often search for the moment when everything went wrong. But the truth is more unsettling. There was no single turning point, no isolated mistake. What defined the war was the accumulation of strategic decisions that escaped control, feeding on their own logic until the cost no longer mattered. Strategy became an end in itself, detached from the lives it consumed. The generals of 1914 did not set out to create mass slaughter. Many were educated, experienced, and deeply confident in their methods, but they were prisoners of their own assumptions. They believed war could be calculated, scheduled, and managed through doctrine. The industrial age shattered that belief. Machine guns, heavy artillery, railways, and mass mobilization transformed conflict into something faster, deadlier, and far less predictable than any plan could contain. Strategy lagged behind reality, and men died in the gap.
One of the most enduring failures was the inability to abandon broken ideas. Even when evidence mounted, command structures resisted change. Admitting strategic failure meant admitting responsibility for catastrophe. Instead, leaders framed disaster as necessity and sacrifice as virtue. This mindset turned battlefields into testing grounds for theories that no longer worked. The war revealed how dangerous it is when ideology outweighs observation. Yet from failure came transformation. The brutal lessons of the First World War reshaped military thought. Combined arms warfare, flexible command, and the importance of logistics and morale became central principles. The blind faith in frontal assault faded. Technology was no longer seen as a miracle cure, but as a tool that required integration and restraint. These lessons would shape the wars that followed, for better and for worse. Still, the shadow of uncontrolled strategy did not disappear. Many of the same patterns re-emerged decades later. Overconfidence, underestimation of the enemy, and the belief that suffering could be controlled continued to haunt modern warfare. The First World War stands as a warning. When strategy becomes detached from human reality, it ceases to be guidance and becomes destruction. The soldiers who fought this war were not symbols or statistics. They were individuals caught inside plans they did not design and could not escape. Letters, diaries, and survivor accounts reveal a recurring truth. Most understood long before their commanders that something had gone terribly wrong. They endured not because they believed in the strategy, but because they believed in each other. In the end, the First World War was not just a failure of diplomacy or leadership, it was a failure of imagination, the inability to foresee how modern war would break every rule it inherited. Strategies meant to deliver victory instead reshaped the world through loss. Borders changed, empires fell, and a generation was marked forever. Understanding these failures is not about assigning blame. It is about remembering what happens when plans are valued more than people, when control is pursued at any cost, and when war is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be avoided. If you've made it to the end of this documentary, leave a comment below with the word uncontrolled to let us know you stayed until the final moment. Tell us what part of this story impacted you the most, or which strategy you believe was the greatest failure of the First World War. Don't forget to leave a like if this deep dive into history added value for you, and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth war documentaries based on real events. Continue watching the videos appearing on your screen now to explore more untold stories from history.